Greetings everybody, this is Dr. Jonathan Cox, your resident race scholar, here with another mini lecture on race. Social movements are defined as conscious, collective, organized attempts to bring about or resist large-scale change in the social order. Now, while there are many types of social movements, one of the most well-known and most often used is the protests. Now, protests and other social movements are used to address social problems in many aspects of society. Now, social movements have been a part of the very fabric of the United States since its beginning. For instance, we could think about historical movements and protests like the Boston Tea Party in 1773, the women's suffrage movements, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom that happened in the 60s, and the Stonewall Uprising that happened in 1969. Now, social movements do not generally arise out of a stable social context. Rather, they arise out of a changing social order. Now, this makes sense if you think about it. If everything is great, there's not really much of a reason to protest. Now, social movements also typically arise from the structure itself. People are likely to act when they experience what is known as relative deprivation. Now, relative deprivation is simply a perceived gap between what people expect and what they actually get. There are many social movements that have happened recently and that are ongoing across the United States today. Now, one of the most well-known, ubiquitous social movements of our time is the Black Lives Matter movement. But we could also talk about many of the other social protests we see, such as social action for immigration and immigrant rights, like the protests against the separation of families and incarceration of immigrant children that happens at the US-Mexico border. We could also look at protests for DACA and Dreamers, or social action for indigenous rights, like the protests against the North Dakota oil pipeline, or the Indigenous Peoples March that happened in 2019. Or we could look at protests that are in support of Palestinian rights, right? The rights of people that exist outside of the United States. Now, these are all examples of newer social movements, which have different ideologies and approaches than earlier movements like the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. Newer, more contemporary social movements tend to be more distrustful of formal organizations and as a result are often decentralized, which means that there's just no centralized leadership and there may not even be one centralized agenda. Now, instead, newer social movements are more responsive to the particular needs of the communities in which the movements are taking place, and they are concerned with the cultural and community rights of these individuals and groups as well. Another feature of newer social movements is the use of social media for mobilization. Now, through social media, information can be much more quickly disseminated, which means that efforts can be more easily coordinated and even shared live. Now, some evidence we see of the ways in which social media and other technologies are being used is through hashtags like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Free Palestine, or even Oscars So White. Protests and other social movements do not happen in a vacuum, however. Now, they are situated in specific social contexts, and as such, the movements and people who are involved, they're going to be viewed differently by different people in the context of overlapping power structures and dominant ideology. For instance, in response to people protesting about issues with police brutality in the criminal justice system, many folks have completely mischaracterized protesters and the movement. Now, because the face of many of these protests are typically black and brown, often associated with Black Lives Matter, in recent years especially, most of this mischaracterization that happens is specifically of the Black Lives Matter protests and protesters, even in situations where the majority of people are not black or are not actually associated with Black Lives Matter. A major reason for the mischaracterization of protests and protesters is uneven and unethical coverage of the protests by the media and other government and public officials. There are several key aspects of this uneven and unethical coverage that we could talk about. First, protests are generally covered from the perspective of those in power, politicians, law enforcement, other institutional sources, instead of covering the protests from the position of those who are protesting, or the people without the power. Now, this is known as elite framing. Now, this also includes only speaking to protesters in the midst of the protest, as opposed to actually including them in discussions that happen after the protests are over. Second, The media and other entities often focus on what is happening at the protests instead of discussing and contextualizing the underlying problems that led to the protests in the first place. Now, an example of this is how we regularly hear about how protesters attack police, but we don't hear as often about how police engage in escalation behavior that facilitates increased conflict. Now, it's impossible to understand what's been happening at these protests and why these protests are taking place without addressing these underlying ongoing historical problems. For instance, racial violence or systemic inequalities. Third, protests are often covered in ways that pit police against protesters. For example, coverage usually describes how the protesters engage in action that requires the police to restore order or protect the public. Now, this creates an us versus them mentality that works to build hostility by positioning the protesters as a threat or as deviants, as opposed to simply people who are seeking social change. Fourth, the media and other entities often focus on the most dramatic individuals and actions in a protest. These are the things that sell stories. Now, they typically show people who are engaging in destructive behavior because it makes for great TV. However, these actions are very often being carried out by a small group of people, many of whom are not actually a part of the protest movement. Now, viewers then use these images to characterize the entire movement and all protesters, when in reality, the vast majority of these individuals are peacefully protesting and law-abiding. Finally, the media and other entities, including other people, often regularly fail to show empathy for the social problems that led to these protests happening. Now, as Martin Luther King famously said, a riot is the language of the unheard. We must understand what is going on at the root of the problems in order to understand why these individuals are out protesting in the first place. Now, as a result of the media and other entity coverage, protests are routinely labeled as violent, radical, and anarchist. And the people, again, a lot of the times these are Black and brown people, they're labeled as animals or are seen as destroying their own communities. Now, people also assert that movements like Black Lives Matter, they're going about things the quote-unquote wrong way, or they're using counterproductive methods that overshadow their possibly very real concerns. Interestingly, many people, particularly white Americans, like to reflect nostalgically on the civil rights movement as an example of people protesting the right way. However, in reality, white Americans responded to Dr. King and the movement as a whole in the same ways that they respond to Black Lives Matter now. So during the 1960s civil rights movement, protesters were viewed as disruptive, wanting too much too fast, and as a danger to quote-unquote American society and democracy. Now, Dr. King himself was characterized as radical and dangerous and accused of inciting violence and dividing the nation. Sound familiar? Don't forget that Dr. King was also killed for leading nonviolent protests, and nonviolent demonstrators were regularly met with civilian and state violence at the hands of white America. Now, we see the same responses for protests today, which helps us understand that it's not really about the ways in which people protest. It never was. It's about what people are protesting and who is doing the protesting. Now, this becomes even more apparent if we think about some very recent protests and demonstrations in the United States, such as the Unite the Right rally that took place in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, where we saw white supremacists, white nationalists, and other far-right groups come together to protest the removal of a Confederate monument. We could also look at the incidents of armed crowds of largely white men and women protesting these stay-at-home orders at the beginning of the COVID pandemic in 2020 in states like Michigan. Now, the state response to these protests, including police and other law enforcement actions, didn't mirror responses to protests by non-white Americans like the historical civil rights movement or the contemporary Black Lives Matter movements. Now, you may even recall that former President Donald Trump spoke very highly of the protesters in Charlottesville and in Michigan, despite the violence that occurred at some of these events and the racist rhetoric of some of these protesters. It's no coincidence that protesters who are largely Black and brown people protesting about the unequal rights of Black and brown Americans are mischaracterized and demonized for the same type of behaviors that white Americans engage in without being labeled in the same way. Here, the power of definition is really important. Who has the ability to name and define things? How is this power then used? Against who is it used? How are various protests defined and by whom? These are all very important questions to consider, and the answers have very real implications for Americans, in particular Americans of color. For instance, a law was recently signed in Florida by Governor Ron DeSantis that actually is one of the toughest restrictions on protesting in the nation, and this is going to disproportionately affect communities of color. Hopefully now you feel a little bit more educated on social movements, specifically the ways in which racism and bias have been used to paint overwhelmingly negative pictures of Americans of color who engage in social protests, while white Americans are largely allowed to engage in these same behaviors without it negatively impacting the view of whites overall, right? Or resulting in restrictive legislation that is going to disproportionately impact certain people, like people of color. Now, as always, I encourage you to go out, do some more investigation and research on your own, keep learning, keep growing, and thank you for paying attention.